And I think we're seeing more of that now with the Corden show, which we will get to soon. But I wanted to go to go back to the chronology because we were talking about, how Comcast was taking over. And I think that was quite a significant moment because Rick was replaced, Conan left. Could you share a bit about what sounds like a very challenging period of time?
Yeah, it was pretty challenging when they made all these changes and Jay took the Tonight Show back and Conan left. It's wild how close and how familial, like family, these shows can become. And Rick certainly, and me as well, like became part of those communities on both shows. So not just having a show essentially leave and like we lost 100 friends in like a day. It was like, it happens a lot in corporate America, unfortunately, where, there are mass budget constrictions and layoffs and it had a similar feeling to that when there's so many people that are no longer there and don't know how long they'll be out of work. And so, you feel for all of them. And at the same time, like there's 150 people on this other show that I'm also very good friends with. They had nothing to do with this. They are told what to do by their bosses as well. And so them coming to work to sort of reconfigure the 10 o'clock show that they'd spent a year working on, or if not longer, and then trying to figure out, all right, well, now we're doing an 11:30 show again. What is that supposed to look like? It's a weird way to think about it, but like, do we have a new motivation? It's how I thought about it. Like, is there a new motivation to do this show? It's not just like, it can't now just be the same thing we just did. People didn't actually like what we just did that much. And so we've been trying to change that there. We have to change again now. Do we do some of the same things we did before? Like, there's just a lot happening all at once. Meanwhile, at Comcast, they're making decisions as to what their new units are going to look like, who's in charge of what. And it's not necessarily all the same people who were making the decisions in that 2010 period of time. But ultimately, once the Comcast deal came together, there was as often happens, like new structure, new people in charge. And the way that they wanted to structure all the divisions changed as well. So they merged the late night department into the alternative and reality department. So there was a new person that took over for Rick, and they didn't need me anymore either, because they have 10 or 11 other executives in the reality wing. They're going to figure out what they want to do. However, for me, like the stresses of that year were really not particularly healthy and took a little bit of the fun out of what I enjoyed most about working in late night. So it's scary when I've worked in the same place for 11 or 12 years to not be there anymore, to have only worked at one place as an adult, which in entertainment, you might have 5 or 6 jobs in the same year. There's a lot of people who move from show to show and wait for that next opportunity and hope that you get along well with people so that they want to work with you again. But I was in a position where like, I wasn't exactly sure what my next role was going to be, but I knew the things that I hadn't done yet and that I wanted to do. And the big blind spot for me was I'd never worked on a production before. It was one of the things that I valued most with Rick and his eye was what he could see that I could not see, like physically. Like he could tell, I've said this before to people, but he could tell when a couch was an inch off from where it was supposed to be next to the desk. And I was like, what are you, crazy? And even the stage manager would be like, are you sure? And then they go and measure and be like, yeah, it's off. Thanks, Rick. I did end up getting to work in production. I still don't have that eye. It's just was, that was very unique to Rick. But I did want to know what it was like. I thought I had an opportunity to work on a show in a different way and just concentrate solely on one show. And I thought that there was, having gotten a chance to develop late night shows, especially with the Jimmy Fallon show, which I had a small role in. I mean, it was Jimmy and he had producers and he had Lorne Michaels and like they had a real sense of what they wanted to do, but they were really generous in terms of looking at writers who I thought would be good there and producers who would be good there. And, we looked at directors together and, they wanted to know my thoughts. And more often they wanted to know Rick's thoughts really on test shows and then on the early weeks of shows and what that progress was going to be like. So I had sort of like a cadre of people I thought I would like to work with and people I thought were really good and people that were on the come up. And I also had maintained really good relationships with the Conan group. And by then they were on CBS and they were looking to expand in late night also. They were on at 11 o'clock at night and they did an hour-long show there, but they were given an opportunity to do a midnight show. And so I pitched an idea for a midnight show, which was even delved sort of even further into the social media universe in terms of like how we watch things, how we absorb information, just sort of a younger skewing, an even younger skewing show that for cable especially could, I thought, have an opportunity to really respond with viewers, and it wouldn't have to be quite as massive a show because they could hone in on sort of the youth demo. So I worked with a comedian who I had seen do stand-up before, but really got exposed to through his podcast called You Made It Weird. And his name's Pete Holmes. And I didn't know him personally, but I met him through a mutual friend and talked to him to gauge whether or not he was interested in potentially hosting the show. And he was. The Conan group knew him. And I pitched my idea. Pete talked about his philosophy of hosting, and everybody clicked really well. And so, we got to pitch that show. I got very lucky once again, like knowing the right people, being around at the right time for even the opportunity to pitch a late night show. And then I got to, because of TBS's relationship with Conan, not really because of me at all, they gave him a chance to make a pilot. And so that's how I got to move into producing, which was great. And I basically spent about 2 years working on the pilot, and then we got picked up and we made a year's worth of shows, which for us was like 80 something episodes. We got to be on the Warner Brothers lot, and we basically got to do everything that we wanted to do in that window. And it was, I talk about it now, and then I'm back to being an executive working at CBS. I can speak 2 languages now. Like I can speak executive and I can speak production. There's a lot of crossover, but it's much different when you're exposed to how a show physically actually works. Whether that is sitting in an edit bay and watching an interview or watching a sketch and knowing what to cut, reacting on the day when a guest drops out. I'm sure you've experienced this before. We have to figure out what to do, which you can't panic. You just have to keep going forward and figure out the next step, and doing your best to prepare as much as you can and leaving enough space for those wild moments where, where something happens in the audience. With like one of the great moments that happened with Pete, he talked about his parents a lot, and he invited them to the show once. And Pete was interviewing another comedian, and in the audience, you could hear his dad say, "Who's that guy?" And Pete had to stop the interview, and he told his guest, "Did you hear that? My dad just said, 'Who's that guy?'" And that became the next 7 minutes of conversation. And, those are like the fun moments that happen on these shows that sort of are still unique to late night. But just the idea of like rolling with punches a little bit and making sure that, a lot of it is, I kind of harken back to being a camp counselor a little bit, dealing with a bunch of 12-year-olds or 13-year-olds and the awkwardness of being a teen and sort of growing up. And the same thing with the 18 or 19-year-olds that you're also in charge of, even if you're a year older than them, keeping those trains moving, making sure everyone is more or less happy or as happy as they can be. And when they're not, figuring out how to mediate. A lot of that happens in production as well. And so being a good listener is a good trait, I think, period. Certainly for a talk show host, but definitely for a producer also.
You mentioned much earlier on about pitching. You pitched to, I believe, Jeff Ross and Conan Bryan. I wonder what that conversation was like. And you shot the pilot with Kyrie. You said before that's the reason the show got picked up.
Yeah. So for Conan and Jeff, that conversation was earlier on. So getting them on board was more about them trusting me as a producer, them trusting Pete as a host, and both of us knowing, Pete and I, that we could rely on Jeff and Conan when we had questions and needed a little bit of help. They had a great infrastructure for us. So it was like they held our hands until we could walk, essentially. While we were figuring out what we wanted to do on the pilot, on that first episode, we were trying to take advantage as much as we could of what was around us and what Pete was doing in his stand-up comedy life that was sort of coexisting at the same time as we were shooting our pilot. One of that included going to like Montreal for the Just for Laughs comedy festival, which we were like, if Pete's going there and he already has to do there, let's send a camera crew with him. Let's send a couple of producers and comedy writers, like a small crew, so that maybe we can get a couple of interviews with people and maybe he can do a sort of a man on the street piece, and let's see if it's good, we'll use it. And if not, like he was already going there anyway, so we didn't lose any time. The other place he was going was Cleveland, which he was doing a stand-up set there. And again, Jeff and Conan were really nice and allowed us to also use the producers and segment producers and talent bookers who worked on the Conan set for while we were shooting the Pete Holmes pilot. I knew all those people from the NBC days, so my working relationship was really strong with them. And Britt Kahn, she was the person who often booked the sports guests for Conan. I was very confident that Kyrie Irving, who was the Rookie of the Year and on the Cleveland Cavaliers basketball team, would be a great talk show guest based on interviews I'd seen that he had done on sports talk or just in print interviews, that he was just a fascinating guy who I thought had a really fun sense of humor. And I thought, like, I bet no one's asked him. I bet no one's asked him yet to do this. And so Britt helped us connect with Kyrie, and they let us go to Cleveland to shoot an interview at like the Cleveland Cavaliers practice facility, which Pete is 6 feet tall. No, sorry, he's 6'6". He's a very tall man. He's taller than Kyrie Irving, but he is not a basketball player and doesn't really care about sports that much. He's enamored with athleticism and excellence, but he's not a guy who watches the game every weekend. And so I was trying to be an efficient, cost-efficient producer. So I did not go to Cleveland, even though I love basketball and I would have loved to meet Kyrie. We sent other people instead. He was completely game for it. Of everything that we did in the pilot, it stood out so much because it was sort of next generation talk show host and next generation athlete in that you are seeing in a completely different way than you'd ever seen him before. And I think if you were going to point to one thing that we did that you could say, there's the potential, it was that interview. And the fact that the network, also TBS and TNT, had a strong relationship with the NBA. And so once we got the pickup, we were able to go to the NBA All-Star game also. And it was in New Orleans that year. And we ended up interviewing like almost a dozen NBA players that we ended up using throughout the year, where they also would have Pete on Inside the NBA, which is a big show that they run on TNT, which is the sister station for TBS. And so we just were like exposed to a completely new audience of people who watch sports more than they necessarily watched entertainment. But if they saw these people interacting across the way, then the hope was, well, maybe they'll tune in. Maybe they'll want to see Pete interview more people.
When you feature sports stars, they are quite interesting because they are not actually in entertainment. So it doesn't necessarily translate to them being superstars on the court and also great interviewees as well, which is important.
Yeah. I think I don't know if it is just access or exposure to all the social media that you can interact with people, but the younger players now are so ready for that moment. It is remarkable how good they are, how fast they are. And so I like it even more now when you get, whether they're coming from the Olympics or the WNBA or the NFL, like this generation is absolutely ready for late night. It's exciting when we get them on because once again, like they'll do something that you don't normally expect to see. And oftentimes, they have a lot of fun and they don't necessarily get to do fun things all year round when they're concentrating on their actual job and their performance. So yeah, it's great when we get to do that.
And so after the Pete Holmes Show, what was your plan? Because I noticed you worked on the e-pilot Hampton Night and broadband pilot.
Yeah, those were the pilots that I worked on after the Pete Holmes Show were both late night adjacent. So they had elements of things that we did in late night, but even more of a pop culture news of the week bend. And on both of those shows, I got to work with some really good friends, which was, I think at this point in my career, like always the goal is work with as many nice people as possible and try to have fun because something's going to hit the fan at some point. And if you're in your bunker with your people, like it makes it a little bit easier. So I was just open to meeting and working with different people, different networks and different cable networks, particularly if I got to work with people that I really enjoyed spending time with. But for me, I think at that point, the most exciting and interesting thing that happened outside of my world was when CBS announced that James Corden was going to take over the 12:30 show, which, I think I've probably said it now too many times. Your audience can get annoyed with me, but I just really love that window. I love that time period. I love what you can do at 12:30. And I didn't know James as a host necessarily. I knew him more as an actor for shows that he'd done in the UK. But as soon as he was announced, I think like a lot of us, we did sort of deep dives into what else had he done. And there were a couple of things that I saw. He did these sort of hour-long documentary style interviews with two different members of Take That, the pop band. And they were both just so nuanced. They were fun. Sometimes they got serious. He had just sort of like this great energy and enthusiasm. And I was like, wow, this is something. And then I watched him host the Brits, the British version of the Grammys. And that was exciting. I'd seen that he'd done an interview with the Prime Minister at the time. And I think that was for a newspaper, but I saw him talk about it and then I read about it. And I was like, well, this is exactly what I was excited about, like the varied amount of interests and ability to listen and ask interesting questions, and let alone he's a Tony winning actor and he has the voice of an angel. So this is a lot of arrows in the quiver, as they say. And I didn't really know that many people at CBS. So I was just like, how do I figure out how to even meet these guys? And then I got really lucky where I got a call from Nina Tassler, who was the president of CBS at the time. And she's now a producer, has her own production company. And she told me that they were looking for an executive to oversee late night on the West Coast. And is that something I'd be interested in? Honestly, I had to think about it for a minute, which in retrospect is incredibly stupid of me, because it was an unbelievable opportunity to work on a show that I was interested in and directly report to the people who ran the network, which I'd never done before. But I was weighed down a little bit by my most recent prior experience of being a network executive, which came with some baggage that I hadn't maybe necessarily talked through yet or accessed all of my feelings about. But I really enjoyed my meeting with Nina. I thought that she would be someone that would be great to work with, but more importantly, work for. And David Staff, who is the president of the CBS studios, I would also be working for him. And I met him and just almost immediately was like, well, these are two of the warmest, most generous people that I've met in television. And this is just a drastically different situation than where I had come from. And they were really honest with me in that, like, they hadn't had somebody for a while on the West Coast who had the type of experience in late night that I did. And so they were going to give me quite a lot of rope to help them know, I think, how to help shape and how to let that show have the runway that it needs to be successful. And so it ended up being a pretty easy yes, to be like, yes, I want to do this and this sounds great. And because now I know what production is like and I know what being an executive is like, I think I might be able to handle this in a different way and treat it a little bit differently than I did before. And then it was just a mad dash to getting the show on the air, because I got hired right around the end of November of 2014. Nobody else was working on the show yet in any significant way, because they were wrapping up their other things, where like Rob Crabb is an executive producer of the show, of the Corden show, but he was still working on the Jimmy Fallon show at the time. James was doing publicity and press for Into the Woods. So he hadn't moved to LA yet. And Ben Winston, who's the other executive producer and the head of Fullwell 73, which is the production company that along with CBS makes the show, he was working on The X Factor in London at the time, and he hadn't moved yet. So when I talk about a mad dash, like, they had to do everything basically in a 3-month window to make it on the air in March of 2015, which is when the show started. And that is both the like terrifying and exciting part of making television, is at a certain point, it's just gotta go on the air. And you hope that you have a couple of those things that you feel strongly about, that you have conviction that you think like this could turn into something. And for James and Ben and Rob, you know, that was Carpool Karaoke, which the first one aired in week 1 of the show. And Roll Call, which was when they do, you know, they have a giant star on and they perform snippets of every movie they've ever done in like a 5 to 7 minute window.
Tom Hanks.
Oh yeah. For someone like Tom Hanks to say yes to an idea like that is such a vote of confidence. And a lot of that credit goes to Sheila Rogers. She's the head of the talent department for Corden. She worked on the Letterman show for many years before then. And so a lot of that was her explaining to talent, like, come, you'll like this. You'll like James. You'll like the show. Something's happening over here. And then for Tom Hanks to be like, all right, that's giving the green light to every other giant star in Hollywood to be like, oh, okay, if Hanks is doing this, I got to take a look at Corden also. And yeah, I mean, like, Tom Hanks, and there were a lot of friends did a lot of great favors and gave a boost to the show in those early days. You know, a lot of these talk shows have to rely on friends in those early days and people who are willing to take that chance. But, you know, the Tom Hanks, the Mariah Careys, the David Beckhams, the Simon Cowells, like, it was some real heavy hitters. And then James and Ben and Rob talk about this a lot, but one of the wildest things that they had pitched, that they were ready to give me like a 45-minute pitch about why it was a good idea, which they wanted to take their show and do it in someone's house for a night.
Which they did in the second week.
They did it in the second week. They shot it in the first week, but they needed the week to edit it. So they were like, here's what we do, and this is why we should do it. We got to keep people surprised. And I was like, you had me on the first sentence. I'm 100% on board. I will explain to anyone else what this will look like and what this will be. This is late night to me. Like, these are the fun things that you get to do. And that was incredible. Like, Beck and who else was on that one? Jeff Goldblum. It was like this who's who of people, animals. We this poor person's house, we just took over for basically the day, and it was all real, and it was absolutely joyous. And like, you don't know, I don't think you know until you're in it how much energy you can get from that type of a show and experience and use to figure out what's the next thing you want to do. And yeah, I mean, like, that's a memory forever.